A very, very warm welcome tonight to this, our next in the series of Parliamentary and Scientific Committee webinars on a key topic, communicating risk. What, who, and why does it matter? Risk, a word much used in parliamentary debates and seldom measured or properly understood or contextualized in the context of multiple public policy debates. So this is organised in partnership with the Hazards Forum. Thank you for that. A very warm welcome to our panel of speakers, each of whom has agreed to give us a short presentation of 10 minutes. There are prizes for those who come in below 8. Richard Roff, Group Process Safety Officer at Costain, welcome. Professor Helen Meese, I can see Helen, founder and CEO of the Care Machine Limited, and Anne Davies, business and, I was going to say criminal lawyer, that would be very libelous, slanderous, crime lawyer, focusing on health and safety, a criminal expert. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website and on our YouTube after this meeting. And after the speaker presentations, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Sam Carling, MP, who will then handle the questions. We're very blessed. We have a whole range of new MPs in Parliament with scientific backgrounds, and Sam is one of them. I'm really delighted. He's one of the vice chairs of this august group, so you'll be in safe hands. When it comes to the questions, please press the Q&A and not the chat button. The team have asked me to highlight that. So the Q&A at the foot of your screen if you wish to ask a question, and Sam will happily sort that out. He'll call out your name and we'll unmute you so that you can then ask your question. So without further ado, over to Richard. Richard, the microphone and the floor and the internet are yours.
So this is a very quick canter. The challenge is now 8 minutes out of 10, but we'll see how we go. 10 to the minus 6, like that's ever going to happen. What I want to give you is a brief reflection of some of the discussions that we have over the years in Hazards Forum and between the interest groups in Hazards Forum. So, okay, just need to make sure that works. Risk. I should say the Hazards Forum has 3 interest groups. Interest groups are natural hazards, engineered systems hazards, and emerging technology hazards. And although they have slightly different focuses, they clearly overlap. It may well be that natural hazards impact engineered systems like transport systems and so on. And likewise, today's emerging technologies will be tomorrow's engineered systems. The kinds of organizations and personal experiences that are represented in Hazards Forum cover a really wide range. We have meteorology, climate, medicine, nuclear energy, nuclear fuels, military, oil, gas, chemical manufacture, pharmaceuticals manufacture, steelmaking, construction, human factors, and many more. So I'm bound to have forgotten some, and I apologize to my colleagues in Hazards Forum for that. So first thing to note, hazard is not the same as risk. And to understand risk, we really need to combine something about consequence and likelihood. So the image I've got over on the right is a sort of simplified diagram. If we understand how bad something can be if it were to go wrong, or the loss, and how often that might happen, then we have some understanding of risk. And in this kind of diagram, risk is increasing to the top right. So this kind of combination of likelihood and consequence is important. Something about likelihood, though, uncertainty can be difficult to model. And there's a couple of QR codes on the screen there. I'm sure you'll be able to get to these later. But there are different views on how modelable uncertainty can be. And certainly anyone who's involved in meteorology, for example, will recognize that uncertainty and the ability to communicate that is a difficult factor. So when we think about the language of risk, risk practitioners, particularly in the sorts of industries are just listed, may well have numerical information about likelihood and so on, but quite often also rely on word models. So word models like how bad, catastrophic through to not significant, how likely, extremely unlikely to regular. But even that is slightly unhelpful if we aren't all on the same page about what those mean. So it may well be that where organizations use word models, they have to kind of define what it means probable, what does it mean to be very unlikely. And then at least groups of people involved in risk management can come to some consistent view. Alternatives in the numerical world, we may say there's a chance 1 in 10 that this item will lead to a loss. But what do we mean? Do we mean per day, per year, per operation? And so it is quite important that we get information at the right level, because per year is quite different from per day. And obviously per operation depends how many times you use an item of equipment or you do a particular activity. So we then get to 1 in a million. It's a turn of phrase, certainly an English turn of phrase, that generally means not very likely at all. Lots of people are happy to take risks of 1 in a million. And of course, when expressed mathematically, that's where I get the title of my presentation from. Yeah, okay, 1 in a million, 10 to the minus 6. Okay, sounds good, but actually, when we say, is that ever going to happen? It may be that it does, and it kind of is important to us then how bad as well as how likely. And of course, whenever we do risk assessments, we have to think about how sure are we? How can we be not certain, but what gives us reassurance that we are clear how bad something could be and no worse, and we're clear how often. It's fair to say that the need to manage risk is a sort of legal requirement in many sectors, and it's certainly true in the health, safety, and environmental protection sphere. It's also true from a financial perspective and from a public company governance perspective. These don't all manage risk in the same way. And we have to think about the difference between individual and societal risks, and particularly the tolerability of risks. So a risk that is imposed on me is different from a risk I choose to take through either work or activities that I do in my life. Image on the right is taken from an HSE guidance document called Reducing Risks, Protecting People. And it's part of a section in that document that's talking about some risks will be unacceptable, some risks will be broadly acceptable, and no more work needs to be done to reduce them. But there's a place, and the legal terminology is where risks have been reduced so far as is reasonably practicable, and that's the legal terminology. It sometimes gets changed to as low as reasonably practicable in industry. So ALARP, if you've ever heard of that. It's not a word in English, but it's a practitioner term. May not be helpful for discussion outside of industry or outside of risk practitioners. The other feature about tolerabilities that may well be different between sectors, and I'll come on to non-equivalent risks in a moment. So if we think about communicating risks, we could talk about high, medium, low risk. We could show an image like the one on the screen that is around, okay, there's a red zone, an amber zone, and a green zone. But what does it kind of mean to be in there? Now, that image over on the right is the sort of thing that I've used in my career and I'm familiar with. There are views on how to communicate risk, and the 2 QR codes on this slide, one is to the Winton Centre for Risk and Evidence Communication at Cambridge, and the other is to John Aston, who's the Harding Professor of Statistics in Public Life. So the one on the left has some great advice, particularly for policymakers and other communicators around risk about what helps, and you may hear more from the other speakers on this kind of area. Now, indeed, it has some views on risk grids like the one shown. I just talked about risk equivalence, so that when we say how bad, we may have to worry about how bad in several different ways. It might be in the safety world, injury to people, but environmental protection, and how are those equivalent? The other feature of equivalence is that something in the top left of this diagram may be said to be equivalent risk as something in the bottom right, but the things at the top left are catastrophic if they go wrong. So is that really an equivalent risk, and is that helpful? And of course, when thinking about your audience, it's all very well for me to show that diagram, but if you're not in the field, then how helpful will that be? So we have to think carefully about what we talk about and how we do that. Just a brief jump left field about what I would call the danger of zero, and zeros in quotes here, because there is no such thing as zero risk. And if one is communicating on risk and we make statements like zero, even people who don't understand risk recognize that zero isn't possible, and there is an opportunity to lose trust with one's audience if we use language that seems to convey a message but is perhaps unhelpful in risk terms. And the other feature I want to talk about here is resilience. Some things that may be extremely expensive or difficult to reduce the chances of happening. It may be that it's more cost effective and better even for society or a given organization to consider resilience. So not let it happen, but if it happens, let's work out how we can most quickly get back to a place where we're happy rather than to worry about trying to reduce the chance of it happening further. I'll come back to resilience in a moment though. Just wanted to talk briefly about complexity. Charles Perrow, way back in the 80s, talked about the idea of normal accidents, by which he was suggesting that in highly complex, tightly coupled systems, even where things are going as we expect, all the risk control systems are working as we expect within normal range, it's possible to have an outcome that's catastrophic. And therefore, in the ever increasingly complex world that we live in, this continues to be a concern. And actually, I guess since the 80s, the world of systems engineering has moved on and understanding of complexity has moved on, but it's one to consider where we may not be properly able to simply model how risks may cascade. And so cascading risks are clear, I guess, from a critical national infrastructure perspective, but may not be in other worlds. So understanding how many steps back your own scenario for loss is related to another organization's. And I would always say, watch out for change. Change is it's always there, but difficult to spot sometimes. So trade-offs in the world of risk, we may have to make trade-offs. We may have dissimilar risks. You know, in the world of health, safety, and environmental management, we may have improved safety at the detriment of higher embedded carbon, and therefore these things are both worth considering, but are dissimilar, and we may have to come to some trade-off position. It's possible at times to convert risk to cost. Indeed, the UK government Green Book has a means to convert risk to cost for national infrastructure, but that might be unhelpful. So an actuarial view, if you like, might be unhelpful if the scenario we're talking about is catastrophic. If it were to occur, it will be catastrophic and it will cost and have the effects that it has. So take care with that. Tolerability may well be different prospectively from retrospectively. You know, a group of knowledgeable people can go, okay, we think this may be a tolerable risk. Things that become newsworthy may find themselves at a much lower tolerability. And the viewer is important. I've put a bullet there about dread risks. I guess things like nuclear energy have historically fallen into this field. People that aren't familiar and understand the subject find it difficult to understand how it can affect them. It's a bit about risk crystallization. Well, if we think there's a risk, then it might happen, but there is a piece about when. So, for example, today's weather is today's weather, but climate may be changing weather subtly over a much longer period. So a climate risk and a risk of the next storm in the UK are quite different things, but are inextricably linked. Activity and exposure is important. If we say a risk is acceptable if we do it once, what about if we do it twice? What about 10 times? This is kind of important to know how we're building up exposure. Individual and population risks are quite different. I choose to ride a mountain bike. Some people may not, so that's an individual risk I've chosen to take, but that's not imposed upon me. And I've talked a little bit about cascading risks. It's fair to say that the outcome may occur elsewhere than where the initiator is in some complex systems. So risk may be calculated starting with how bad, how often. Okay, we're not happy with that. We need to add some risk control measures. And this gets us to a final risk that we're happy with in any given organization. First thing I would say is inherently safer is better. In this image at the bottom, if I can reduce the scale of that hazard or how hazardous it is, then that's much better as far as that hazard's impact on people or the environment or society at large. That said, if we've put risk control measures in or barriers, as I've shown them here, it may well be that we're happy with that. The worry here is that we don't take a lot of attention and place it against the barriers, we may find ourselves here at the head of the gold arrow. So, okay, this is simplified extensively, but in this case, three barriers are in a failed state, and we're 3/4 of the way to disaster. And nothing will necessarily tell us that unless we go looking at the barriers. So anyone who has put in risk control systems in their organization needs to keep an eye on whether they're still working. So green boxes around my barriers. So in summary, I hope that canter was of the right sort of scale, but it's important we understand what it means when somebody is talking about risk, and it may well be that we have to say, please explain what you mean by risk. Complexity can make assessment difficult. Inherently safer is better. There's research and advice on communicating risks, and we'll hear a bit more about that in a moment. That there may well be trade-offs necessary, and I think one should be honest about what the trade-offs are and open about what they are. Some loss scenarios, a resilience approach might be a better way of working. And my final point was, any organization that's put in place risk control measures needs to look after them. If they're not looked after, then we don't quite know what the current risk is today. So I hope that makes some sense. I realize questions are going to come at the end, so I'll hand over. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you. Brilliant. That's got the juices flowing. I'm now going to hand over to Helen Meese, who's going to tell us all about the care machine and her take on it. I'm also handing over to Sam Carlin, who's on the call on the webinar. Sam, after this, perhaps you could take the reins and introduce Anne and then steer us through the Q&A. So Helen, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak today about the communication of risk, particularly in healthcare and medtech sectors. Whether you are a scientist, an engineer, a parliamentarian, or just a member of the public, risk is something that we all encounter and interpret on a daily basis. However, the communication of risk effectively, as you've already heard from Richard, is no small feat, and especially in critical fields like healthcare, where the stakes are incredibly high and the implications are very far-reaching. So in the next 10 minutes or so, I am going to attempt to explore the technical the reasons behind why we need to look at risk and in the healthcare sector, and how the technical community and policymakers can improve the communication of risk. Also looking at the trade-offs and complexities of different risks and the social tolerance for risk. So let's start off by looking at the way that technical experts, shall we say, communicate risk. Scientists and engineers are at the forefront of innovation and safety in healthcare and medtech. However, their work often involves risks that must be conveyed to a very diverse audience. Now, I believe that there are three things that we need to consider when presenting to the general public. The first is simplifying without distorting. Avoid technical jargon when communicating with non-expert audiences. This seems obvious, but isn't as easy as it sounds. Instead, we need to use analogies and visual aids to make complex concepts relatable. For example, instead of discussing probabilities in percentages, frame them in everyday terms, such as 1 in 1,000, as Richard was mentioning before. Contextualizing the risk as well is very important. Place risks in context by comparing them to familiar scenarios. For instance, when you're explaining the risks of a medical device, relate it to the risks of everyday activities like driving or flying. And acknowledge uncertainty. Transparency really is key. Acknowledging what is known and what is uncertain and what steps are being taken to address those uncertainties. These are the critical points to be made, and this builds trust and avoids creating false expectations. And parliamentarians too play a critical role in bridging the gap between technical experts and the public. To do so effectively, they need to communicate in a way that resonates with their constituents, balancing the technical accuracy with accessibility. So, for example, when presenting data about the risks of a new vaccine, an MP might explain clinical trials show a 1 in 100,000 chance of severe side effects, which is far lower than the risks associated with the disease itself. Infographics as well can be an excellent way to further help illustrate this point. And this was something that came to light very much so during COVID. And I've included this picture here, as you can see the graphs in the background.
Next slide, please, Chris.
Are you seeing my slides okay?
No, sorry, I was making a joke. I shouldn't have said that.
Oh,
I was
my
remembering
apologies.
the national psychodrama of... Next slide, please, Chris.
Yes, I had totally forgotten about that. But yes, unfortunately, making sure that our slides were free flowing and the information was there was something that we all got very used to, wasn't it, during COVID? So before you step in front of a camera, like the wonderful Chris Whitty here, MPs and people who are in the public sector need to really prepare a checklist. And this will help them ensure that they've got the right information before they get in front of an audience. So thinking about things like what is the magnitude of the risk, what is the population or system affected, what is the level of uncertainty surrounding the risk, and what measures do we have in place to mitigate it? For instance, when debating the rollout of a medical device, an MP might ask the questions of an expert: what are the known risks associated with this device? How are they being managed, and what contingency plans exist for rare adverse events? And focusing on facts and avoiding amplifying fears unnecessarily are key. So avoiding sensationalism, basically, because this can really erode public trust and can lead to poor decision making on their part. So when you're addressing concerns about, say, hospital overcrowding, you might frame the issue constructively, like saying, while ICU occupancy is at 85%, contingency measures, including additional staffing and bed expansion, are in place, ensuring patient care will not be compromised. So by adopting these kind of approaches, those in public office can really effectively communicate complex health risks and foster informed public dialogue and trust at the same time. Risk communication in healthcare often involves addressing trade-offs between dissimilar risks and varying timeframes. The complexity of these decisions is particularly evident in critical care settings, such as intensive care units, ICUs, where resources like beds and staff are often very limited, and every decision carries a life or death implication. ICU clinicians frequently face the issue of admission and bumping decisions. where they must prioritise one patient's care over another's. For instance, in deciding whether to admit a critically ill patient, some clinicians might choose to admit a patient with deteriorating health, emphasising the ethical need to provide a chance of survival, whilst others may cite the limited ICU resources and the improbability of recovery. On avoiding firefighting, when we're talking about risk timeframes, immediate risks can often completely overshadow long-term consequences. If we think about research showing the discharge of a patient prematurely, this can free up an ICU capacity for a hospital for new cases to be taken in, but it can increase post-discharge mortality by up to 2.5 times, especially if that discharge occurs at night. So creating those understandings of time frame is critical. Decision making is further complicated by framing effects, where clinicians interpret scenarios differently based on their personal experiences as opposed to institutional norms. So, for example, you find that young trainees often focus on the clinical parameters, while older, more senior doctors may consider the broader ethical implications and ensuring equitable care for all. So institutional differences in risk tolerance also play a critical part. So communicating these trade-offs requires a transparency and acknowledgement of uncertainties. Explaining why a particular decision was made, such as prioritising one patient over another, can help the public to understand the complexities of resource allocation and in healthcare. Not all risk is perceived equally. Dread risks, such as those involving fatalities or irreversible harm, elicit stronger emotional reactions than the more mundane risks. So this discrepancy is often driven by psychological factors and societal values, which can vary significantly between healthcare experts and the general public. So experts evaluate risks using very statistical evidence and probabilities, whereas the general public tend to focus on emotional and moral dimensions. So recognizing that fear is not always going to be proportional to the statistical likelihood is really quite important. I'm going to jump forward a little bit here because I recognize that I'm getting to the end of my time. It's really important to understand the differences between uncertainty and risk, and Richard has already touched on that. But it's really an important factor to be sure about the tools that might be available to explain to people how things might have levels of uncertainty. So, for example, thinking about phrases like preliminary findings or active monitoring, these can help to set realistic expectations in the public and help them to understand more clearly about the differences between risk and uncertainty. And Richard has already touched on this, but there is no such thing as zero risk. For example, considering a surgical procedure, data from the World Health Organization indicates that approximately 1 in 10 patients in high-income countries experience harm whilst receiving hospital care, with nearly half of those incidents being preventable. So whilst that kind of statistic underscores the presence of risk, it also highlights the critical role of mitigation strategies, such as adhering to safety protocols. And I won't go into this in too much detail, but the adherence to regulations and standards is something that's critical. I, as an engineer, have to make sure that every medical device and piece of technology I work on is related to a standard in some way. But we have something called the ISO 13485, which is for medical devices. And we make sure that we undergo rigorous testing and quality control of medical devices. So compliancy with these sorts of standards is critical, and being able to demonstrate that to the population and to the public is really quite important. So just to conclude then, active risk communication in healthcare and medtech sectors requires a level of clarity, transparency, and above all, empathy, which is often difficult for scientists and engineers to engage with. But by contextualizing risk, addressing trade-offs and distinguishing between uncertainty and risk, we can foster trust and informed decision making. So whether you are a scientist, an engineer, or somebody in the public sector, your role in this process is invaluable. I appreciate that I have gone over my time, but thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to any questions.
Thank you very much, Helen. That was really, really interesting, and thanks for sharing all that with us. Can I just say before we invite our next speaker, if anyone else in the audience does have questions, please feel free to start feeding those in through the Q&A function. And then once Anne has spoken, we'll start to get to those. So yeah, don't feel you have to wait. So with that, if I can invite Anne Davies to speak. So Anne is a business crime lawyer with a focus on health and safety, and a range of experience dealing with regulatory investigations and prosecutions over the last 30 years. So over to you, Anne.
Thank you very much. I speak from the perspective of solicitor, and I recognise, having heard the other two presentations, that mine will be very, very different in tone. My experience is working with organisations when incidents have happened, assisting them with investigations, and then in the event that they are prosecuted, working through the prosecution. The sectors that I mainly work in are construction, agriculture, manufacturing, logistics. I don't work for oil and gas companies or companies that are COMA regulated, and therefore I fully recognise that my experience is within those sectors that have arguably less oversight on a day-to-day basis by a regulator. So if I move to my first slide, my talk is "It'll never happen to us." Why? And why do I say that? Well, my invitation to speak today was based on a talk that I gave at a seminar on ALARP some years ago, when I rather confidently said that you might be the best expert or the best engineer in the land, but if you cannot communicate with a judge or a jury your message, then you're in real trouble. I said that based on my experience. That was repeated back to me in my invitation to speak today. And I thought, well, I better now try and find if there is any basis to that other than just simply my experience. Thankfully, my trusted paralegal, Lauren Turnbull, who's on this call, thank you to her, she found a paper that reinforced my point, which is a Morgan and Fishoff paper, Mental Models for Scientists Communicating with the Public. It's a National Academy of Sciences from Arizona State University, which identified that unlike traditional science communication, risk communication requires dialogue, because there is no way of knowing what information people need without talking to them. The other point that I thought was quite interesting when I was trying to bring together my personal experience is that there is a psychological finding that people overestimate how well they understand one another. And that again reinforced some of the experiences that I've had when it comes to trying to defend organisations by illustrating that they have reduced risk to ALARP levels, namely as low as reasonably practicable. But to do so, it requires the organisation and individuals within the organisation to have properly identified those risks. And that's where, in my experience, the gap exists, in that there has been a failure to properly identify the risks. And although risk assessments might be present and although mitigation measures are in place, they are incapable of leading to a defence being advanced where an incident has happened because of that failure. So why will it never happen to us? How is that the response that I get when I present cases that have been decided by the courts and reported? And the answer is, we have procedures, we train people, we brief people, we have no RIDDOs, we have very low incidence rates, we have competent staff. But all of the above, again, assumes that there has been a proper appreciation of the risks in the first place. I've presented on the Croydon Tram sentencing remarks. Firstly, there is some resistance to follow that a train collision can have any relevance to, say, a construction or an agricultural business or an engineering business. Then it's, well, we would have followed up on actions. We would have followed up on inspections. And some of you will recall that some of the sentencing remarks in that case was about the failure to follow up on certain actions and the failure to follow up on certain inspections. Or in the case of a prosecution brought against a well-known construction company, where they had 2 incidents of overhead cables being struck on the M6 motorway. And the sentencing remarks essentially identify that there was a failure to learn lessons based on the first incident and allowing something similar to happen on a second occasion. Thankfully, nobody was injured and no harm occurred. But again, most organisations will respond to that by saying, well, we learn our lessons. We would never allow something to happen like that on another occasion. Or if I talk about the train crash that occurred in Scotland, and I talk about the Rail Accident Investigation Board's report, quite often the response is, well, we inspect our assets regularly. We would never install something that isn't according to its design. And yet again, in truth, it does happen. And I'm keen to try and explore, why is it that the response is, it'll never happen to us? Is it because there isn't a sense of corporate and personal vulnerability? So how do we convert that sentiment into, it might happen to us? How is a sense of vulnerability created that leads to a thorough review of risk and then the implementation of appropriate control measures? Sometimes we as lawyers present cases based on facts rather than on themes. And what I've been trying to do more recently is to move the conversation from facts associated with an incident to themes. So rather than a crane collapse or a building collapse or a piece of equipment failing, identifying themes around a failure to plan, a failure to supervise, a failure to manage, workers not competent, equipment not suitable. And that therefore cuts across all sectors and cuts across most of the facts of some of these cases that are reported. Dame Judith Hackett gave a very interesting talk at the Thomas Ashton Institute lectures some time ago. And she modified one of the expressions that arose out of the Piper Alpha case. And her modification was, there are no new accidents, just different people making the same mistakes because of failure to recognise the relevance to them of other people's experience and therefore not learning. I've persuaded one board that I work with to have this quote in all their board packs, and hence when they're reviewing their incidents and they're reviewing their accidents, they are now trying to review them in the context of themes rather than in the context of, this was an incident that happened at our location in wherever in the British Isles. And that somehow or other has, at least within those sectors, assisted the conversation around risk moving to a different level. My next slide deals with a couple of topics that certainly Helen has already touched upon about communication. So when cases are prosecuted, they are either fully defended and are heard by a judge and jury generally, or if a plea of guilt is entered, then a mitigation statement is advanced at a mitigation hearing, again before a judge. These are judges that sit in the Crown Courts and they deal with general crime on a day-to-day basis. Workplace safety will be a rare type of case to be before them. They will have limited, if no, familiarity with workplace-related procedures, and hence, therefore, any expert's report needs to be communicated to either the judge and the jury or just the judge in plain, straightforward English, enabling it to be understood. diagrams could be useful, and we also have on occasions brought models into court to try and bring alive what could be a fairly complex issue to understand. And why is that important? Well, the sentencing guidelines that exist at the moment for health and safety breaches categorize culpability into very high, medium, and low. And those categorizations are basically, to achieve low, one has to show that all industry standards have been applied, but on this particular occasion, it failed. And hence, therefore, to secure a finding of low culpability in a case that's being litigated, often we will work with experts to try and illustrate to a judge that all industry standards have been applied, but that on this occasion it failed. Communication at inquests is also important because coroners increasingly have a powerful tool, namely the issue of a prevention of future deaths reports. Coroners again deal with many different types of deaths, but very infrequently do they deal with deaths in the workplace, and hence being able to explain workplace-related safety and workplace-related risk is extremely important, and in particular to seek to avoid a prevention of future deaths report. These are available widely on the coroner's website and frequently have been issued in cases involving cyclists being killed by vehicles, in particular lorries, and reports being issued to vehicle manufacturers in relation to things such as visibility of a driver from a cab when it comes to their travelling on the highway. But as I say, there is often a resistance to see the relevance outside their own sector. So this again is a repeat of the communicating court judgments to stakeholders. I won't repeat what I've already said, save that in my experience, trying to encourage organisations to look wider than their own sectors and to appreciate the relevance of some of the remarks in the sentencing guidelines can be challenging. ALARP has been mentioned by both speakers. I just simply say that when I look at its application on a day-to-day basis in an organisation that is looking at how it minimises or mitigates risk within the workplace, frequently they find it difficult to explain how they have reached the decision as to how they balance risk between time, money and trouble. And often there isn't that analysis that is capable of being presented either to a regulator or to a court. And there is a Court of Appeal decision of many, many years ago now, which makes clear that when assessing risk, one must look beyond the obvious, is the phrase that's used in the judgment. And I find that quite often it's the obvious risks that are still addressed rather than the risks beyond the obvious. And if we move to the next page, I also wanted to touch on the communication of risk and the learning that can be derived from public inquiries. For example, if we look at Nimrod, which is in defence, Grenfell in housing, post office, public sector, there are some consistent themes that come through those findings, despite those inquiries being, at least in the case of Nimrod, many years apart. And the themes are around leadership, managing contractors, remaining an intelligent customer, transparency, resources, executives understanding their responsibility, culture, where safety is seen as being more important than cost and spend. And one might say, well, why am I addressing this in the context of risk? Without having the appreciation of those lessons learned, it is difficult to persuade an organisation to be more thorough in its own assessment of risk within the organisation. And managing contractors is a very, very, very regular area where organisations find that they underestimate the risks involved, both in terms of the selection process and thereafter the oversight of the contractor. Health and safety guidance, there's a plethora. It's grown over the years. It's intended to be easy and capable of being understood. There was research in 2003 by the Health and Safety Executive themselves, where they recognised that many of their leaflets have an objective reading age that is higher than desired. That was in 2003. I reviewed today the average reading age of the UK population, which is between 9 and 12. The other area that I think is important when we consider risk communication in the context of the workplace is that SMEs make up 99.8% of the business population. I look at one guidance document that was produced by the Health and Safety Executive and the IOD. It's a guidance to directors on how to manage safety within their workplaces. It's incredible how few directors are familiar with that publication. It's also deemed to be an easily readable publication, which certainly from my point of view, it is. But there are plenty of directors that I have given that document to who will find it rather cumbersome to read. And one then poses the question, can something such as that be reduced in detail and possibly its style slightly altered as it has now been published for many, many, many years. Finally, corporate memory. This again is not based on any research, but it does strike me, based on the organisations that I work with, that those who have been through an incident that either has involved a fatality or has involved a life-changing health condition for an individual, the individuals that have been involved in those incidents do have a more acute sense of vulnerability in their appreciation of risk within their place of work. But the challenge is that leaders, directors, boards, they change very regularly. Their term of office is, say, 3 to 5 years, and that corporate memory slips away ever so quickly. Finally, a point that I haven't had time to elaborate on or consider in any detail, but with the shift to hybrid working, home working, are our workplaces considering and reflecting on the risks that are now emerging, and in particular, one big one in my view, which is driving in the course of employment. Driving to and from work is not regarded as driving in the course of employment, but if somebody's place of work is now their home, every journey that they do for the purposes of work will be driving in the course of employment. And I doubt whether that risk has been fully assessed by most workplaces as we see the place of work change. Thank you very much for listening.
So thank you all, speakers, Richard, Helen, and that's been a very fast canter through a very complex and very wide-ranging subject. One of the concerns I have with this, we so often communicate risks in this matrix that you outlined at the beginning, Richard, with along one axis we have the likelihood, on the other axis we have the impact in some form or other. However, in a number of instances I've been working with clients on at the moment, the likelihood is due to some form of malicious act, some human intervention rather than a natural disaster or something. But they're having to compare these risks alongside other risks which have better quantifiable sort of likelihood underpinning them. And I'm taken back to the R2P2 diagram of the tolerability of risk here. And I think what this highlights, and I'm very keen to hear the panel's views on, how do we compare and contrast when we come to making these decisions? How do we compare and contrast risks where we have a real clear understanding of its structure and those where there is, if you like, a human intervention, some very asymmetric sort of outcome to it, or very asymmetric likelihood to it, to put it more correctly? And can we do it better? Is this ultimately subjective, and is this ultimately a political decision, how we draw the line?
Well, okay, shall I start? Thanks, David, for your question. I think the aspect of intent would, in the terms I was discussing it, come under the uncertainty area, but it much less amenable to any kind of prediction. The other feature that's worth, I think, thinking about in that respect, and we saw this with airports and large public buildings following certain events, where a resilience approach was taken or an absolute prevention approach was taken. So, around the world, there are incidents of structural collapse as a result of terrorist actions, which, when the civil engineers thought about it, said, okay, we can't stop that terrorist action, but we could sure as hell stop the structure from collapsing as a result of that. So that's a sort of resilience approach. And I guess the large posts you see outside of airport terminals are in the opposite sense are, okay, we now have some experience as a society of a particular kind of terrorist action. Let us prevent that in total.
Yeah,
that's me. There are others, I'm sure. Go for it.
I would agree with that, Richard. And I think that's a good explanation. I think, David, certainly in my experience, where I've gone from sort of heavy engineering into healthcare, and suddenly the human factor has become far more prominent in the management of risk. It is very subjective, obviously, and it's very dependent on the people who are looking at that problem. I think one of the things that we do need to be able to do is have broader risk databases, so enable organizations and individuals to be able to put their documents and things like that into a national sort of database, if you like, obviously anonymized, but in a way that we can then draw on that. And I'm sure Anne has probably got some points, when you're in a situation in court where you're having to draw on evidence of other things that have happened to put forward your argument. This would be a really useful thing to have, and it's not something that I think we have as a country, and certainly not internationally. But being able, we have systems now where we could do that and be able to log some of these very rare examples, so that people have got somewhere to go to actually draw on precedent, which would be really helpful.
Thank you.
I don't think I really have very much to add, other than to echo what Helen said, the difficulty of trying to defend cases where the primary cause, or a large part of the cause, is human intervention. And then it's whether the organisation can point to their own experiences. Obviously, if an organisation has had quite a lot of experience of terrorist threats, then they have some information that they can build on. But others will have none. And we live in an increasingly unpredictable world, where that human intervention is behaving in a very different way to what we may necessarily expect that behaviour to be. I work with a very large port authority, and certainly it's the sort of areas where we're having to think very carefully about the changing nature of that human intervention risk in relation to its assets and its people.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for those responses. So next up, we have John Steed, who has a very short question. I think it's probably directed to Anne. Are you with us? Oh, hello, John.
Hello there. Can you hear me?
We can.
Yeah, just a very simple question. Can we have a reference to the paper that Anne mentioned right at the beginning, please? I think, was it a Canadian paper?
It was Arizona. I will make that available, and I'm sure the organisers can circulate that.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. So then, moving very swiftly on, we have Roman Bulgachev. Are you with us, Roman?
Right. Thank you very much for the opportunity to ask the question. We do talk a lot about risk-based decision-making, risk-informed decision-making, and this comes very naturally to some organizations, and it doesn't come that naturally to other organizations. What would be your recommendations? How would we introduce risk-thinking mindset into decision-making so that organizations, both within corporate world and government, can make risk-informed decisions where appropriate? Thank you.
Could I just remind everyone that's asking questions, would you mind just letting us know which organization you're from as well?
I'm a risk authority with BP.
Thank you. Who wants to take that?
Yeah, I'll throw my 10 pence in, I suppose. Healthcare is a really interesting area because it's not something that comes naturally to clinicians when looking at risk, as I mentioned in my talk. Often it's the dread risk as opposed to the statistical numbers that really drive a lot of decision making. So I think from my point of view, it comes down to education and training. At the end of the day, we are not including this in areas outside of science and technology. We as engineers, it's innate in what we do because we're taught it almost from day one of starting, our degrees. So I think there's a lot to be said about including, particularly in the world that we live in today, the issues around risk and uncertainty and that and quality as well, that will help people to understand and make informed decisions on things that are going on around them. So for me, I think it really comes down to education.
Anybody else want to contribute?
Yeah, I'll have a go. I think you're right, and of course, getting to high-level folks in any organisation is an interesting task when what you're trying to do is educate them. Because hey, how did I get here if I wasn't already a very knowledgeable person? Might be a mindset that we have to break through. A few years ago, there was some research done by Vike and Sutcliffe, which ended up in a book called Managing the Unexpected, around the traits of highly reliable organizations. And indeed, HSE has issued a paper on that. There's a research report on that. But the traits of highly reliable organizations or mindful organizations include what was called healthy unease, and that was referred to by Anne, I think. So attempting to get organizational decision makers to recognize when they might be suffering various biases as well, of which there are a great many. Indeed, I referred to the Green Book, which does talk about biases in decision making. So education, but recognition that actually being less optimistic gives you better outcomes in decision making than necessarily assuming everything's perfect all the time. I hope that helps and is additive.
Anne, if you'd like to, no pressure.
I'll just simply echo that last point, because I think all my talk was really based on organisations having too much confidence in their assessment of risk, which ultimately quite often is insufficient and flawed.
Thank you very much. So can I just point out, there's a couple of questions come through that just say anonymous attendee on our end, and obviously I can't call you if we don't know who you are. So if whoever's just sent those through, if you would just mind resending those with your name, that would be great. But over to you, Chris Rapley.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the presentation. It's very interesting. Yes, Chris Rapley, Professor of Climate Science at UCL and a member of the committee. I'm interested in how one can avoid a kind of cutoff that we see many examples of. The Fukushima example is a particularly pertinent one, where those planning for safety decided that the combination of a massive tsunami and an earthquake was so unlikely that they wouldn't deal with it, which meant there was a sort of binary cutoff. That is, if the disaster had been slightly less severe there were procedures and equipment in place for the teams on the ground to deal with it. But going through that threshold, they were left to make it up as they went along. And it does seem to me that there's possibly some way that one could taper the investments and so on for these very, very low probability, but very, very damaging events. And I just wondered if the field had moved on since Fukushima and many other examples to deal with that, and if that's written up somewhere, because I'd be quite interested in looking into it. It's really for Richard, I think.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I'm not. It's an interesting point because having been involved in risk assessments on high hazard facilities for all sorts of things down the years, that you definitely feel okay, once we've got low enough, let's stop worrying about it. It's an interesting point you make about the sort of binary nature of the responses, which is something I was trying to reflect in my comments around resilience. We may say, okay, well, we're not going to prevent an even bigger tsunami, but what would we do in emergency planning? So in some respects, in risk analysis, that simplified model of 4 barriers I showed you could be rearranged into what's called a bow tie diagram, where there are some barriers that prevent a loss of control and some barriers that allow recovery or reduced consequence. And so aspects of recovery should be part of our thinking. If we think there is a potential catastrophic outcome, we should think about, well, okay, what if then? What if we lose control in that way? How will we find out? How will we stop it escalating? But it's certainly a mindset that you identify that I'm not aware of any research on, I have to say. So a great question, but I haven't really properly answered it.
I'm not sure I can add much to that, really, to be honest, other than my own personal experience of being on an oil refinery in the 1990s, which was hit by lightning and caused a cascade of actions which resulted in the refinery blowing up. And that could not have been predicted in any way, shape or form that bolt of lightning was going to cause such a catastrophic failure. So I think things have moved on, and particularly in your field as well, Chris, where, in terms of looking at things like sustainability within climate change emergencies and so on, I think we're starting to get a little bit more of a grip on it and realizing that we do have to at least put these things down on paper, even if we don't think that they might happen. So, but yeah, I'm the same as Richard. I can't think that anything from a standards point of view has changed much in the last sort of 20 or 30 years.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So the first question from earlier on, now we have a name. So that would be Fiona Gleed. Could we have Fiona Gleed in?
Hello, I'm Fiona Glade from the Open University, and I've been doing some research around flooding. And one of the things that is noticeable there is that we use flood risk maps in different scenarios. So we use them both for pervasive risks at a location, denoted very low to high, and we then also use flood risk maps when there is an event, and we're then describing the risks of flooding as possible or expected. But then neither of those maps actually show the areas that are currently flooded, which can be a significant hazard, for example, if motorists try driving through a low-lying flooded area of road. So how would you suggest modifying these types and these descriptions so the types and phases of risk can be better communicated?
Who wants to have a go there?
I'd love to refer your question to one of my colleagues in the Hazards Forum who knows a bit more about this than me. But it's an interesting point you make, because there are other unknowns to those who have drawn the maps around the status of drainage systems, let's say, or other things, other activities in an area that make some of the local flooding much more difficult to predict. I think these are sort of word models, and I would just say if we go back to the kind of understanding of what low, medium, high means that I referred to, which is necessary even for risk practitioners, let alone communication with the public, and then also to Helen's points about drawing parallels with other things that people experience in life for understanding of what we mean, that might help. Yeah, I think those phrases would be understood by hydrologists, but not necessarily others, and that's a challenge, I guess, to people who understand it. And you'll be much more familiar than I am with that. As I say, I'd prefer to pass this on, but I haven't got everybody, all the Hazards Forum people with me online. And Helen, what do you think?
It's a bit out of my wheelhouse, I think. But it comes back to a point I made earlier about the presentation of data. And I in order to buy my house recently, I used the flood maps to actually understand what was going to be a risk in Lincolnshire. So visualization of data, certainly in healthcare, is becoming much more prominent. And I think being able to transfer that into a way that enables people outside of the science community to at least have an understanding, if nothing else, to allow them to make decisions, I think is important. But I'm afraid answering Fiona's question is a little bit out of my expertise, really, I'm afraid.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. So now we have Mark McBride.
Very good. Thank you very much. My name is Mark McBride. I'm a member of the Hazards Forum, and I'm also an inspector in the Office for Nuclear Regulation. And in the UK, we have a regulatory approach based on risk. So regulators of all types need to have regard for risk in the way they carry out their function. How would you compare the pros and cons of a risk-based regulatory approach with a prescriptive regulatory approach, and how can we improve the effectiveness of our risk-based approach in the UK?
Any takers? Helen?
Do you want to start, Richard? Again,
Okay,
my
yeah.
focus is healthcare, so.
Okay, yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. The pros of a risk-based approach allows the organization in question to choose the way in which it clears the hurdle, and there are maybe many ways to do that, and indeed, as new technologies come along, there may be improved ways to do that. The cons of that are that we need organizations with any level of hazard to understand risk. And, you know, as we've been discussing, perhaps that's less well understood, and you know, related stories where it's perhaps less well understood. If one were to take a prescriptive approach, then it's very clear what is compliant. However, the onus on that compliance being, let's say, safe enough, environmentally secure enough, low enough risk, however you choose to style it, is with the regulator. And for sure, in some of the education I do on process safety, there are incidents and events from the US, and the US regulatory regime in this respect is somewhat prescriptive. So we could find that compliance is still not safe enough or not low enough risk. I think that going to how would we improve UK's regulatory regime in this area, maybe there is a piece around requiring you know, leaders of organizations to have an understanding of risk management in this respect. And okay, I'm not just talking about company directors, because that can be a single person in a very small organization, but certainly for the sorts of organisations that you will deal with in ONR, there may be some expectation about the level of education of the leaders of an organisation like that around risk and risk understanding that perhaps you could impose, and that may help, may drive up standards. Of course, the counter to that is perhaps that costs money, and I don't just mean money, I mean time and time away from other things around the economy. So it is, again, a non-equivalent risk that needs to be traded off. Those are my thoughts.
Yeah, it's very interesting actually, because from a healthcare point of view, when it comes to medical device and technology, we're expected to abide by the regulatory standards. You can't deviate from those when it comes to designing a medical device. So everybody has got the same set of documents that they have got to design their device to, and they have to meet those standards. So in some respects, we're probably much more driven by the regulatory guidance than we are making a business decision kind of risk assessment. So perhaps other industries have got an opportunity to learn from, particularly for heavy industry, perhaps needs to turn its attention to the more publicly facing organisations or sectors like medical device manufacture, that they could learn some of those lessons from and actually absorb them into their own business practices in a way that would help create more consistency across the processes, possibly.
And just adding to the point on education, I frequently speak with shareholders, and although a lot of the executives don't have risk associated with safety within their training, they build that through experience during their executive careers. But shareholders quite often have no experience at all, either through their education or through their working day experience of risk, particularly in the sectors or industries where they are shareholders. You think of pension funds who will be shareholders in a number of different industries and will have limited understanding of risk, certainly in the context of safety, which is my experience in those. So some sort of education program for shareholders, I think, would shift the dial quite considerably.
Thank you very much, Anne. So we've hit 6:15. Now there's one more question that came in at just after 6 that I think is a very good one to end on. So we'll try and squeeze it in very quickly. But can I ask for really brief answers on it if that's possible? So can we get in Barry Brooks?
Good evening, thank you. Yes, I'm a member of the Worshipful Company of Engineers. We're regular attenders, and as some of you will recall, we also ask some detailed questions. This one, I think, is fairly straightforward. I think we've had a very useful, stimulating scamper over the issue of risk in just an hour. Key question, though, is what does the panel want parliamentarians to do with their new knowledge, since this is their debate? Thank you.
It's a big one.
Okay, so briefly, educate yourselves about risk and read the guidance on how to communicate risk, and try to engage people in, I think, as Helen said, a discussion about risk rather than a one-way process. And there is no such thing as zero, is another final point.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what I would like parliamentarians to take away from this is that science is paramount in the way that they present themselves and present data. Buddy up with someone from the Health Forum, listen to me, the Hazards Forum. These people know their stuff. They have vast amounts of experience, and to be able to have a conversation with them on a regular basis is something that you really should think about doing. And make sure you have that checklist of questions that you want to ask an expert, so that you can get the correct information before you go in front of your colleagues or in front of the general population.
I think I'll finish where I started, which is the paper that emphasised that risk communication requires dialogue, which I think is what we're all saying, because there is no way really of knowing what information people need without actually talking and engaging with them. So that two-way discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And yeah, I mean, I actually happen to have a background in science myself, and I think it's really important that more MPs are able to educate themselves around how we communicate a lot of this stuff. So this has been a really useful discussion. So just another thank you to all of our speakers. There's been a couple more questions coming through the chat. What we'll do is we'll perhaps just circulate those by email if any of the speakers feel able to come back on any of them. That'd be great. But thank you so much for your time. Really great to have you here. I just want to very briefly thank everyone who's made this meeting possible today. So first of all, that will be Louise Vassy and Anna McNeil from the Hazards Forum for their assistance in facilitating the discussion, as well as, of course, the audience and the PNS team, the PNSC team. So that will be Karen Smith, Lee Jeffs, Ben Allen and Sue Wharton, who will be writing up a report for the discussion on our website. Our next discussion is in Parliament, and that's on Tuesday the 17th of February. It's being held in cooperation with the Institute of Physics and Engineering in Medicine, where the theme will be building a healthcare science workforce equipped to face the grand challenges. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a good evening.